Installing an ignition switch onto a 1990 through 2002 Jeep, Chrysler, Dodge, or Plymouth product can be a very challenging proposition for even a seasoned repair veteran. Today we are going to take you step by step through the proper procedure to replace the ignition switch on a 1995 Jeep Cherokee with a tilt steering column. Remember to first disconnect the negative battery terminal from the battery. Remove the tilt wheel arm by turning it counterclockwise. You will now need a Torx bit driver to remove the upper and lower steering column trim panels. We now have access to the ignition switch. Remove the ignition key from the lock cylinder and set it aside for later use. Unplug the small illumination and chime electrical connector located on the side of the ignition switch. Using a tamper-proof Torx bit, remove the 3 switch mounting screws. Pull the switch straight away from the steering column until the column lock actuator on the bottom of the switch is out of the column. Carefully release the 2 lock tabs on the ignition switch harness connector and unplug the electrical harness from the ignition switch. You will now need to transfer the key lock cylinder from the original switch to the new switch. We found the easiest place to do this is on the bench. Insert the ignition key back into the lock cylinder and turn it to the start position. On the side of the ignition switch, you will see the lock cylinder lock pin location. Insert a small screwdriver or punch into the hole and depress the lock pin. The lock cylinder should withdraw slightly from the ignition switch. Turn the ignition key to the off position and remove the key from the cylinder. The lock cylinder can now be removed from the ignition switch. If the cylinder does not come out, repeat the previous steps. Ensure the column lock actuator is turned to the 3 o'clock position. With the ignition key removed, slide the lock cylinder into the ignition switch by aligning the location of the lock pin cavity on the ignition switch housing to the lock pin on the lock cylinder. With the lock cylinder in the housing, install the ignition key into the lock cylinder. While pressing inward on the key, rotate the switch to the start position and back to the accessory position. Observe the lock cylinder lock pin. The pin should now be inserted into the lock pin cavity. If the pin did not pop into the cavity, repeat the previous step. A final check on the vehicle to ensure that the shift lock actuator is in the 6 o'clock position and the column lock actuator flag is in the 3 o'clock position. With the new ignition switch assembled, remove the ignition key from the lock cylinder. Plug the ignition switch harness into the new ignition switch. Be certain the wire harness connector lock tabs are securely latched onto the ignition switch. Press the ignition switch against the column. The switch should lay flat against the column with little force exerted. Install the 3 mounting screws and torque to proper specs. Plug the small wire harness back into the side of the ignition switch. Install the upper and lower column trim shields and the tilt wheel release arm. Reconnect the negative battery terminal and test the installation.